When I put the worn brass key onto the glass table, the boardroom fell silent. Like a gavel, its clink reverberated. Mason, my half-brother, flinched just a little across from me. I noticed the change behind his self-assured smile, that glimmer of discomfort. And suddenly, I was aware. I said, "Funny thing," in a composed tone. In Dad's old leather folio, I discovered this. You know, the one that neither of us ever touched. With his fingers tapping furiously on the armrest, Mason snorted. "Claire, this again!" I wasn't staring at him, though. I was seeing how the other men in the room, the general counsel, the CFO, and the most dependable board members of our late father, reacted. My father, Theodore Lennox, a self-made giant who transformed Lennox Development Group from a dilapidated lumber mill into a $90 million real estate empire, had once shaken hands with each of them, and now the wolves were circling him just a week in the earth. Mason is among them, Mason in particular. As though he had been born there, he sat in our father's chair and was immediately drinking from the crystal tumbler that Dad used to nurse his scotch. Naturally, it was all theater, a power attitude. Mason, however, was always skilled at acting like someone he wasn't. He believed he had buried everything, but now the key, which was ancient, burnished, and slightly bent at the edge, rested between us like a silent witness. I folded my arms and reclined in my chair. A drawer cannot be opened with this key. Doesn't correspond with the penthouse safe. However, it opens up something. Mason's mouth moved. Excellent, because I wasn't sure a week ago. I just had the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I had no proof that Mason was not the sole successor to the corporation, as my father had abruptly decided. 2 days following the funeral, the will was read. Chilly, brutal, lawful. Mason had received everything, including the Manhattan home, the company shares, the board proxy votes, and the real estate holdings. Not divided, not talked about, not even given credit. Me, in addition to the contents of my father's study to be chosen personally. I received the condo in Portland where I already resided, a mahogany-wrapped consolation prize. The lawyer who had broken the news had appeared nearly ashamed. Mason, though. He didn't try to hide his smile. I sat by myself that evening in the study, the only room that had been occupied since Dad's passing. The key had been hidden inside a leather-bound planner that bore the year Dad left his daily job. I believed that he had started preparing us both for future leadership roles that year. A key and a planner. 2 artifacts. Or 2 breadcrumbs, perhaps. I combed through every document I could locate for the following 48 hours. And I became aware of the pattern. Contracts signed with out-of-date information. Updates that are purportedly digital only lack timestamp metadata. One specific operating charter revision, which granted emergency succession rights, was dated the day after Dad had spent 12 hours asleep in surgery. However, his signature was there somehow. Nice and tidy. Not possible. I was hesitant to make accusations. Not quite yet. However, I was prepared to observe. The second hint then came to light in the form of a whisper from an elderly board member. I heard it while I was on my way to the 14th floor. Mason had already in private asked to take control of the financial portfolio before the reading of the will. 3 days remained till he was formally proclaimed the heir. I had stopped watching now, sitting across from him, the brass key between us. I was getting ready. Mason laughed. "Whatever, Claire. With that device, are you going to unleash the spirits of Dad's disappointment?" I smiled a little at him. "No," I replied. "I will uncover the truth." I then turned to face the board. All executive authorizations and leadership transition paperwork signed over the last 6 months should be formally audited per my request. Mason won't mind if there's nothing to conceal. Like a stretched wire, the strain broke. Mason's expression hardened. The CFO moved about in his chair. After every board meeting, I imagined my father, who is quiet, restrained, and meticulous, holding that key in his palm and turning it over, as if it represented more than just metal. Because it might have. It might have always done so. As I stepped out into the chilly evening air outside Lenox Tower, the metal key clinked softly in my jacket pocket. I sensed it as soon as I left that boardroom, the pain of being marginalized. The ringing in my ears was too loud to be muffled by the bustle of Manhattan. In the past, that key had represented heritage. It felt like a gravestone now. I tried to clear my brain by walking 20 blocks in heels that I could no longer feel. But no matter how far I went, I could never forget my father's voice. Claire, leadership isn't inherited. It's low, deliberate, and proud. It has been established throughout time. I had made every effort to establish my worth. I was at the top of my Wharton class. 10 years of toiling in the infrastructure sector of the corporation, which is the most severe and unglamorous aspect of real estate development. I was in steel-toe boots and hard hats, checking city permits and concrete pours, while Mason hosted influencers at charity parties. I had earned every bit of my reputation, and it had made no difference. When I was 15, my mother had died. 2 years later, Mason entered our lives. He was the adorable kid of my father's first marriage, conveniently grown up and recently reunited. He had been marketed as the future of Lenox by the time I was 25. He talked and looked the part, and worse, he actually believed it. Dad had repeatedly promised me, however, that performance would take precedence above showmanship. He would say, "I don't care who makes noise. When something goes wrong, I don't care who shows up." I had arrived. However, the will now stated otherwise, and I kept asking myself if my father had changed his mind. Or had it been altered for him? That evening, I went back to my flat and poured a glass of wine that I didn't want. From the kitchen window, my reflection gazed back at me, pallid, exhausted, and shaky around the edges. With my fingertips tracing the ink grooves where Dad had scribbled meeting hours client initials and private comments that no one else could decipher, I opened the old planner once more. It was like betrayal, on top of sadness. Until I noticed something. February 14th. In small whisper-like script scrawled in the margins, remove the second key from the ledger room. The ledger room. The main office wasn't where it was. It took place in the company's original offices in Midtown, which are now used for storage and archives. It had been years since I had been inside. I touched the planner entry once more. The second key. There had therefore been 2. I discovered a brass one in my pocket and wrapped my palm around it. Then, like a freight train, the pain struck. Where was the second key now? If there was one who owned it. A memory suddenly sprang to mind. My father had requested me to stay, following a quarterly meeting 6 months prior. Due to ocular fatigue, he had been more reserved than normal. "Use this if anything happens." He continued, passing me a sealed packet. "And have faith in yourself." I had never opened it, though. I had thought it was a letter, something heartfelt. Funeral instructions. I didn't want to consider losing him. Now, like a flare in the dark, that envelope blazed in my imagination. I ran to the closet in my bedroom and grabbed the box of vintage scarves from behind. The envelope remained untouched and uncreased. I tore it open with shaky fingers. There was no letter inside. The form was a power of attorney, signed 2 months before his passing. Completed, giving me permission to represent Lenox Development Group in the event of incapacitation or dispute, not Mason. I was struck so forcefully that I fell to the bed, the paper trembling in my grasp. I was my father's choice. I had earned his trust. However, he kept it to himself. The file had not been made public. the board was unaware. Mason must have learned about it, or was afraid of it, and taken action before the truth came to light. The bold, decisive, and unmistakably his signature at the bottom caught my attention. My throat ached. Legacy was no longer the only consideration. It was theft. It became personal now. With unsteady legs, I got up and looked at the key once more. Even from beyond the dead, my father had been instructing me and warning me. That ledger room held something secret. Mason was aware of it. He had staked everything on me not retaliating. I would freeze in that sadness. But I wasn't frozen by sadness. A fire had been started by it. I would begin pulling threads tomorrow, one by one. 2 days later, I was standing in front of the historic building in Midtown that had formerly been the birthplace of Lenox Development. Its brick front, which had long since been replaced by steel towers, seemed to be from another era. Outside the basement archives, I inserted the key into the corroded lock. After resisting, it clicked. The stench of time metal dust and dry paper filled the space beyond. A lengthy hallway in front of me was lined with record cabinets and storage containers that were labeled with the division year and project code. I located it halfway down. Beneath a shelf is a black safe set into the concrete wall, almost unnoticeable. A small letter was scratched into the steel door. TL, with my heart racing, I dropped on my knees and inserted the brass key. It pivoted. There was nothing dramatic inside, no gold or bearer bonds. Only a portable SSD drive and a flat black folder. Copies of contracts were in the folder. Instead of the stylized signature found on Mason's inheritance documents, my father's original signature was present on all of them. Moreover, timestamps on his internal work terminal indicated the creation and editing dates of every document. But I stopped cold after reading one page. A note written by hand. Claire, if you're reading this, then you found the truth. Mason's ambition always worried me. I hope I'm wrong. But if I'm not, prove it. Be the leader this company deserves. Dad. I closed my eyes and reclined on the floor. He was aware. He had some knowledge. I connected the SSD to a private air-gapped laptop that I used to store confidential client information back at my residence. I almost dropped the machine when I discovered what I did. Voice memos were present, emails, and video from surveillance, from my father's home office's private server. The first audio file I clicked. The room echoed with my father's voice. Mason went straight up to the notary today, inquired as to whether my signature permission might be accelerated. I acted as though I didn't know. Claire inquired about the financial deficits for Q4. She's intelligent. She will find out what's happening before anyone else does if she senses it. I'll revise the power of attorney document tomorrow and store it in the archive. As the parts came together, I sat quietly. The will had not been falsified by Mason. Not right away. He may have even falsified paperwork while under sedation, trapped a dying guy, and manipulated him. The actual offense, however, was more covert. In the month prior to Dad's last hospital stay, a legal amendment was submitted by an independent estate lawyer. This change was made after Mason had discreetly moved all of his legal representation to a Connecticut firm where he had previously interned. Smooth, not invisible, though. The video, however, was the twist. I watched Mason sitting in my father's study, putting a USB drive into Dad's computer, and typing quickly in grainy black and white time-stamped footage. The day the final will was notarized 3 days prior. I had been out of town that same day. He had altered internal company documents. I let out a slow breath. I had freezing hands. I sent the files and video to 2 locations via email. I used to work in infrastructure and trusted this digital forensic consultant. Mason had inexplicably fired Mr. Halperin, my father's first lawyer, 6 weeks prior to Dad's passing. Within 12 hours, both responses were received. The consultant attested to the fact that the video files were genuine and original. The email's information matched the firm's server backup logs. Mason had gained access to files that he shouldn't have. Halperin, too. In response, he used 3 words. "It's worse, Claire." An hour later, he gave me a call. It appears that Mason had started selling off portions of the Lennox estate and giving minority stakes to foreign companies. Silently. Slowly. I was sick to my stomach. There wouldn't be a company left to fight for if I didn't take action quickly. I realized it then. This has nothing to do with taking back my job. It was about preserving what my father had created before Mason destroyed it and took his money. My father had underlined a unique board clause that hadn't been used in more than 2 decades, so I took out the black folder once more and turned to the page. Clause 7D, Emergency Override Vote. The board had the authority to suspend a newly chosen heir's leadership until an audit was conducted if they thought the heir was acting in a way that compromised the integrity of the business. With my power of attorney, the digital evidence of tampering, and the surveillance film, I have enough to make it work, and I wouldn't simply stop Mason if I timed it correctly. His last hope would be destroyed by me. The chairman declared, "Claire Lennox has called this emergency session under Clause 7D. Her case will be heard." 12 board members, both men and women who had worked with my father, accumulated riches with him, and now sat with the future of his business in their hands, looked back at me. With his lawyer at his side, Mason sat right across from me and appeared at ease, too laid back. I put the brass key on the table and gently rose up. I said that my father had left me this key. It unlocked a safe he kept hidden from everyone. There were several signed and recorded files, as well as one document that everyone should view. I pressed the remote control. Behind me, a screen descended. The first slide shows a scanned copy of Theodore Lennox's power of attorney, designating me as his legal representative in the event of health decline or corporate succession dispute. Slide 2. Metadata, indicating that the document Mason filed to execute the will came from a personal account that was not connected to any of Dad's validated systems. Slide 3. Video surveillance. Shocks. 3 days prior to the estate renovation, Mason was spotted in pixelated gray, connecting a USB to Dad's personal workstation. Abruptly, he stood up. "That video is not real," I said calmly. "A forensic analyst has verified it. We have IP access logs, timestamps, and even an email trail that demonstrates the unauthorized file edit." The room became silent. I wasn't finished, though. The silent transfer of 5% of Lennox Development's minority ownership to a Cayman Islands trust is depicted in Slide 4, a financial trail. The authorization's signature, Mason's. This wasn't inheritance, I stated steadily. Asset stripping was what this was. My father's body wasn't even cold when he started selling off parts of the business. The chairman looked at Mason. "Is this accurate?" Mason's expression contorted. He pointed a finger at me and said he was going to give it all to her. She was always the favorite. The excellent one, always. I was worthy of something. I dropped the letter at that point. My father's handwriting, which has been digitized and duplicated, has been kept in a safe. Weeks before his last hospital stay, he had written it. It wasn't long, unambiguous, tragic. Claire was correct if this makes it to the board. I have faith that she will take action if Mason has taken any advances behind my back. All I ask is that the business survive me. Even if blood doesn't prevail, let integrity win. There was silence in the room, until someone muttered, "We must cast our votes." Mason, however, snapped as the chairman reached for the motion slip. "You said we were covered," he screamed, turning to face someone behind me. I went cold. I turned after that. Eleanor Monroe stood close to the doorway, her pale lips pinched into a narrow line. The previous head of staff of our father, my guide, the woman who had assisted in my upbringing following the passing of my mother. The emotional turn came as a shock. When Dad became ill, she had been the one to stealthily relocate files. The one who assured me that, "Your father has everything planned out." She had also been aware. I met her gaze. "You assisted him?" I inquired. I hardly spoke above a whisper. She cast her gaze downward. I had no idea how far he would push it. Now, Mason was yelling. "It has to do with control regarding deserving the business." The board, however, had lost interest. The room's betrayal had taken a different turn. I moved to the front, grabbed the brass key, and turned to face the chairman. I proposed to remove Mason Lennox from all executive positions while an urgent shareholder audit and thorough investigation are conducted. A pause. Next, one of the board members said, "Seconded." Another said, "Third." There was a unanimous vote. Mason's lawyer began to protest, but he was dismissed. They called security. Although I didn't see Mason leave the room, I could hear his voice, which was a mix of incredulity and anger. "Claire, this is not over." However, it was. Not because I had prevailed, but because the one thing he had never understood, that truth leaves footprints, had exposed him. And I'd followed all of them. I placed the brass key on the desk when I entered my father's former office, which is now mine 3 days after the board vote. Mason used to slump behind the same desk, smirking and sipping a drink of pilfered scotch. It was clean now. Ego-free. Reclaimed. The motion to freeze all transactions Mason started within the last 90 days has already been submitted by the company's legal staff. They brought in an outside auditing firm. Additionally, a comprehensive executive restructuring plan led by me was disclosed by the board. However, the most important choice was still to be made: what to do with Mason. The estate lawyer, Mr. Halperin, had suggested criminal charges for stealing, deception, manipulation of documents. All of the charges were up for debate. However, I pondered what my father might have done that evening while I was by myself in my office. Not the entrepreneur. The dad. He was a believer in redemption, but with a price. So I decided. 2 lawyers accompanied Mason as he was led into the meeting room the following morning. He no longer had his cufflinks on. His outfit was overly baggy. He seems worn out. As I gave him the documents, he remained silent. He would formally agree to give up all voting rights, sell back his shares at a lower price sign, a public resignation letter, and permanently leave all Lennox properties. In return, we wouldn't file a criminal complaint. It was not execution, but exile. He gazed at the paper for a while. He signed after that. His hand shook, from the knowledge that it was finished, not from dread. At last, the facade of invulnerability had crumbled. His face took on a new expression as he pushed the contract back over the table and gave me my first look. Not animosity, not conceit, just a loss. "He was always with you," Mason remarked softly. "He never looked at me the way he looked at you, even when I tried to act fake." I didn't answer. Not with malice. Uncertain. Since he was correct. My father loved what was real not more than he loved me. It was never for sale either. Mason got up. Not a guard. Not much fanfare. Just a man leaving a story that he had lost control of. I delivered my first speech to the entire firm as the formal CEO the next week. Power wasn't the issue. It has to do with fixing. I mentioned openness. The goal is to rebuild trust in the brand and its supporters. About restoring what ambition had nearly ruined. And I concluded with only one phrase. Trust is not something we inherit. We deserve it. The applause felt different as I left the stage. It's grounded, yet not noisy. An exhale from a room. Weeks went by. Months after. The business steadied. Projects started up again. Investors came back. And I opened a drawer I had never cared to examine before one morning, while I was tidying up the shelves in my father's office. There was a handwritten, unsealed message inside. Claire, you've already discovered what Mason never did if you found this. What you leave behind is not your legacy. It is what you safeguard while you are still alive. Father, I grasped the brass key once again. It no longer felt like a key. It had the feel of a pledge. I had also retained it.